The first complaint arrived 3 days after Ethan Carter opened his seafood market on the waterfront. The second came 2 days later, then another, and another. By the end of the second month, a wealthy HOA president named Veronica had filed 14 separate complaints trying to shut down his business. She claimed the seafood market was hurting property values for the luxury waterfront community nearby. Every inspection cleared him. Every permit checked out. Still, she wouldn't stop. What Veronica didn't realize was that one of Ethan's regular customers, a quiet older man who bought fresh shrimp every Friday morning, was about to change everything. Ethan Carter had spent the better part of 2 years saving every dollar he could before he finally signed the lease on that small building at the edge of Harbor Point's waterfront district. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Weathered cedar planks painted the color of a foggy morning, a hand-painted sign above the door that read Carter's Fresh Catch, and a covered porch wide enough for a few wooden chairs and a chalkboard menu. But to Ethan, it was everything. He had grown up 40 miles inland in a town where the closest thing to fresh seafood was the frozen fish section at the grocery store, and he had always believed that the people of Harbor Point deserved better than that. He had apprenticed under a commercial fisherman for 3 seasons, learned which boats came in at what hours, built relationships with the dock workers, who could tell him which catch was worth buying and which wasn't. And by the time he unlocked that cedar door on opening day, he felt ready for whatever came next. The market was modest, but well-stocked. Ethan rose before sunrise every Tuesday and Friday to meet the morning boat, selecting the best of whatever the trawlers had brought in. By 7 in the morning, the display cases would be filled with whole fish packed in crushed ice, jumbo, shrimp, still faintly smelling of salt water, blue crab kept cool in ventilated trays, and bags of little neck clams that he sourced from a small family operation 30 miles up the coast. The back room had a kitchen where Ethan prepared his specialty items, homemade crab cakes, pan-fried to a perfect golden crust, a thick and creamy New England chowder that he ladled into takeaway containers, and a smoked bluefish spread that became something of a local legend within the first few weeks. He kept the prices fair. He wrapped everything in wax paper and explained where it came from if someone asked. He remembered the names of the people who came back a second time and a third and a fourth. Harbor Point was the kind of town that rewarded honest work. It was a coastal community of about 12,000 people, not so small that everyone knew each other's business, but not so large that a new storefront could go unnoticed. The waterfront district had seen better days. Several of the old businesses had closed over the years, leaving empty storefronts with faded awnings and peeling paint. And the few that remained were a mix of a bait and tackle shop, a kayak rental operation that only opened in summer, and a diner that served breakfast and lunch and closed at 2 in the afternoon. Carter's Fresh Catch fit naturally into that landscape. It felt like it belonged there, like the building had been waiting for exactly this kind of use. The regulars came quickly, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret who bought whole flounder every week and always had a new recipe she wanted to try. A young couple, the Hendersons, who stopped in every Saturday and spent 20 minutes deliberating over which species of clam to take home. A group of men from the harbor master's office who rotated through on their lunch breaks and argued good-naturedly about whose wife made better chowder, theirs or Ethan's. Tourists, too, started finding their way in, often guided by word of mouth from the bed and breakfast owners along the main road who recommended Carter's as one of the authentic local experiences worth seeking out. By the end of his first month, Ethan had not gotten rich, but he had built something real. He had also, for the first time in his adult life, felt genuinely proud of something he had made with his own hands, not inherited, not stumbled into, but built step by deliberate step. He had no way of knowing on the afternoon that a gleaming black SUV pulled into the small parking area in front of his market that the next 2 months would test everything he had worked for. The vehicle was large enough that it took up a full space and part of a second. It was the kind of SUV that belonged in a different zip code, polished to a mirror finish with tinted windows and chrome trim that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the weathered cedar siding of Carter's Fresh Catch look even more humble by contrast. The woman who stepped out moved with the deliberate energy of someone who had never once second-guessed her own importance. She was in her mid-50s with highlighted blonde hair pulled back severely, and a posture so rigid it suggested years of practice. She wore pressed white slacks and a linen blazer, and she surveyed the parking area with the expression of someone who had just found a hair in their soup. Her name was Veronica Hargrove, and she was the president of the Bayside Estates Homeowners Association, a title she referred to in conversation often enough that Ethan would eventually come to think of it as part of her name. Bayside Estates was the gated community that occupied the elevated ridge overlooking the northern end of the waterfront district, a collection of 14 custom-built homes that had been developed about 7 years prior and marketed specifically on the basis of their pristine harbor views and exclusive coastal lifestyle. The homes there were worth quite a bit. Property values in Bayside Estates were something of a fixation for Veronica, who had served as HOA president since the community's first full year of operation, and who had in that time successfully lobbied against a proposed public boat launch, a food truck event permit, and a mural that the Harbor Point Arts Council had wanted to paint on the retaining wall at the base of the ridge. Ethan had heard of Bayside Estates in the vague way that one hears of a neighborhood without having any particular feeling about it. He had not heard of Veronica Hargrove specifically, and when she walked through his front door that afternoon, he assumed she was a customer and greeted her the same way he greeted everyone, with a nod and a mention that the shrimp had come in that morning. She did not look at the shrimp. She looked at the sign above the display case, which Ethan had painted himself in block letters on a piece of reclaimed pine. She looked at the chalkboard on the far wall listing the day's prices. She looked at the ceiling fan circulating the cool air. And then she turned to Ethan with an expression that suggested she had already formed a comprehensive opinion and was now merely confirming it. She introduced herself as the president of the Bayside Estates HOA and explained that she was visiting as a courtesy to share some concerns before things escalated. The sign, she said, was not in keeping with the aesthetic of the waterfront district. The smell, she said this with a particular emphasis, drawing the word out slightly. The smell of the fish had been noted by several residents as a nuisance. The parking area was insufficient, and the boats at the nearby dock created noise during early morning hours. She used the phrase property values 3 times in under 4 minutes. She used the phrase community standards twice. Ethan listened. He explained politely that the building sat on commercially zoned land, that he held all required permits from the county, that his operating hours were within the bounds established by the town's noise ordinance, and that a waterfront district had historically involved the presence of fish. He said this last part without any particular sharpness, as a simple statement of fact. Veronica did not appear to find it helpful. She left after about 10 minutes. Pausing at the door to take one more look around the market with an expression that managed to communicate both displeasure and finality. Ethan watched the SUV back out of the parking area and turned back to the grouper he had been filleting before she arrived. He thought briefly that the visit would come to nothing. He finished the fillet, wrapped it, and labeled it, and put it in the case. I was wrong about the visit coming to nothing. 3 days after Veronica Hargrove's first appearance at the market, a man in a pale green uniform arrived with a clipboard. He was from the county's Department of Noise and Environmental Quality, and he was responding to a complaint. The complaint alleged that Carter's Fresh Catch was generating excessive noise during early morning hours as a result of delivery vehicles and the sound of ice being unloaded from coolers. The inspector was professional and efficient. He measured decibel levels. He reviewed Ethan's delivery schedule. He checked the timestamps on the dock activity logs. He thanked Ethan for his cooperation and left. 4 days later, a letter arrived confirming that no violations had been found and the complaint had been closed. Ethan filed the letter in a folder he had labeled Permits and Correspondence and went back to prepping for the weekend rush. Ethan did not immediately connect the inspection to Veronica Hargrove's visit. He assumed it was a coincidence or perhaps a general sweep of the waterfront district. He mentioned it to his neighbor at the bait shop, an older man named Dennis, who had operated his business there for 11 years, and Dennis laughed and said that inspections happened all the time and not to worry about it. Ethan went back to work. He had a full week ahead of him. A restaurant in the next town over had placed its first wholesale order, and he needed to coordinate with the boat captain, who supplied his halibut, to make sure the timing worked out. He was busy in the way that a small business owner in an early growth period is always busy, with 17 things pulling for his attention simultaneously and the unrelenting calendar of supply, prep, and service underlying all of it. The second complaint arrived the following week. This one concerned the signage. A complaint had been filed alleging that the hand-painted sign above the door of Carter's Fresh Catch was not compliant with Harbor Point's commercial signage ordinance, which specified maximum dimensions and required the use of a permitted sign contractor for any permanent exterior signage. A town inspector arrived, measured the sign, reviewed the ordinance, and determined that the sign being painted directly onto the building's fascia board, rather than affixed as a separate structure, fell within a category exempt from the contractor requirement. The inspector wrote up his findings, cited no violations, and closed the complaint. He apologized on his way out for taking up Ethan's time. The third complaint came within days of the second. This one was about the parking area. The complaint alleged that the gravel lot in front of the market was insufficient to accommodate customer volume, and that overflow parking was occurring on the adjacent unpaved shoulder in a manner that violated a town traffic regulation. An inspector from the transportation department arrived, measured the lot, reviewed traffic circulation records, and noted that while the shoulder use was technically irregular, it was consistent with practices across the entire waterfront district, and that no citation would be issued given the context. He noted in his report that the complaint appeared to originate from a location outside the immediate vicinity of the market. He also observed, in the careful bureaucratic language of someone who has seen this kind of thing before, that the described condition was not meaningfully different from conditions that had existed along the waterfront road for at least the past several years, without generating any previous complaint. By the time the fourth complaint arrived, this one alleging that the outdoor display of seafood in ventilated coolers on the porch constituted a health code issue. Ethan had begun to see the pattern clearly. He mentioned it to Dennis again, and this time, Dennis didn't laugh. He just looked at Ethan with the steady expression of someone confirming a thing both of them already understood and said quietly, "That's Bayside." It was 2 words, and they contained everything. Ethan called his permit consultant that afternoon and asked for a full review of all his documentation, not because he believed anything was wrong, but because he understood now that the situation required a different kind of preparation than running a seafood market ordinarily did. Everything was in order. He had known it would be. He started keeping a log recording each complaint by date and subject and outcome, building a record of his own to set against whatever might come next. The complaints arrived with a regularity that, had it not been so genuinely exhausting, might have been impressive in its consistency. Veronica Hargrove had found a rhythm, and she worked within it methodically, filing each new grievance just far enough apart that the relevant department had time to process the previous one before the next arrived. This was not accidental. The spacing suggested research and understanding of processing timelines and departmental workflows that pointed to prior experience with the system, or at the very least, a great deal of time spent on the phone with clerical staff. Complaint 5 alleged that the delivery trucks servicing the market were exceeding weight limits on the waterfront access road and causing damage to the pavement. The road was a county road. The county's Public Works Division sent an engineer to assess the pavement condition and review the axle weight records of permitted delivery vehicles in the area. The pavement showed normal wear consistent with its age and typical commercial use. No violations were cited. Complaint 6 alleged that the ice storage bins visible from the exterior of the market constituted an eyesore and were in violation of a Harbor Point beautification ordinance that the complaint cited by number. The inspector who responded reported that no such provision of the ordinance applied to functional commercial equipment and noted in his report that the bins were clean, properly maintained, and positioned in a manner consistent with standard retail seafood operations. Complaint 7 concerned the operation of the market's exhaust fan, which vented the kitchen area to the exterior of the building. The complaint alleged that the fan was creating a persistent odor nuisance for nearby residents. The inspector measured the exhaust velocity, reviewed the kitchen ventilation standards applicable to commercial food service operations, and confirmed that the system met all relevant requirements. He also noted in language that was factual but carried a faint suggestion of weariness that the market was located in a waterfront commercial district where the presence of food-related odors was expected and normal. Complaint 8 was about the outdoor seating. Ethan had added 3 small tables and 6 chairs to the porch area in his 6th week of operation, intending them for customers who wanted to eat their chowder on site. The complaint alleged that the outdoor seating constituted an expansion of the market's commercial footprint beyond what was permitted under the original business license. The inspector reviewed the license, consulted with the town's business development office, and confirmed that the seating fell within the scope of the market's permitted commercial activities and required no additional licensing. Ethan absorbed each inspection with the same careful courtesy. He had a system now. He greeted the inspector at the door, offered a cup of coffee, answered every question fully and without hesitation, and provided whatever documentation was requested. Most of the inspectors were polite. Some were visibly uncomfortable in the way that people become become uncomfortable when they realize they are being used as a tool for something that has nothing to do with their actual job. A few had begun to recognize Ethan's address from the queue of incoming complaints and had mentioned it to each other in the way that colleagues share information about recurring situations that are consuming departmental time without producing any findings of violation. By complaint number 10, Ethan had developed what he privately thought of as his inspection posture, the calm, measured way he stood at the counter when the knock came at the door, the way he set down whatever he was doing without any visible frustration and walked over to let them in. He had started by that point to be able to predict approximately when the next one would arrive based on the pattern he had charted in his log. It was not a pleasant kind of foresight. He was not sleeping as well as he had in his first weeks. He thought about the complaints in the mornings when he was at the dock, and he thought about them in the evenings when he was cleaning and closing down the shop, and he tried very hard not to think about them during the hours in between, because during those hours he had a business to run. He did not call Veronica Hargrove. He did not send a letter to the HOA. He did not complain to the town council or ask anyone to intervene on his behalf. He simply showed up every day, opened the cases, filled them with ice, and whatever had come in from the boats made his chowder and waited on his customers. What he did not allow himself to realize during those difficult weeks was that the complaints were doing something he had not anticipated. They were making him famous. Word travels in a harbor town. The way water moves around an obstruction, not stopped, but redirected, and often faster for the interference. The inspectors talked, not in any improper way, not in any way that violated their professional responsibilities, but in the ordinary human way that people who do a job together mention things to each other. They mentioned the waterfront market and the volume of complaints and the fact that not one of those complaints had produced a single finding of violation. Word got to the town clerk's office, and from there it spread to the counter of the breakfast diner, and from the diner it went to the hardware store and the barber shop and the front desk of the bed and breakfasts along the main road. People were curious. Some of them had already been to Carter's Fresh Catch and liked it. Others had heard about it from someone who had been there. The story that circulated was simple and carried its own emotional logic. A man had opened a seafood market, done everything right, and was being systematically targeted by the HOA from the fancy neighborhood on the ridge because they didn't like the look of his sign. Whether or not that was a fully accurate summary of the situation was beside the point. It had the ring of truth, and in a town where the waterfront district was a shared public resource that most people felt some attachment to, it generated a specific kind of solidarity. The Saturday after the 10th inspection, Ethan had his busiest morning since opening day. People he had never seen before came in and bought shrimp they didn't have an immediate plan for and lingered at the chowder station and asked questions about where the fish came from. A couple came in who said they had driven 40 minutes from a neighboring town because they had read something about the market online and wanted to see what the fuss was about. A woman asked Ethan whether he was the one having trouble with the neighborhood association, and when he confirmed it, she bought 2 pounds of crab cakes and told him she'd be back. Veronica Hargrove drove past that Saturday morning, and the sight of the parking area full of cars and the line of customers at the porch window did not appear to improve her disposition. Ethan saw the black SUV slow as it passed, and then accelerate again, and he went back to wrapping the order in front of him. He had learned by that point to take satisfaction in smaller things than vindication, the smell of good chowder simmering, the sound of the bell above the door, the weight of a full display case at the start of a good morning. He allowed himself those satisfactions without reaching for anything larger. The 11th, 12th, and 13th complaints came and went the way the others had. Each one found nothing. Each one consumed time, the inspector's time, the department's administrative time, and a portion of Ethan's time and mental energy that he would have preferred to spend on other things. But the business was growing faster than it had any business growing given the circumstances, and Ethan suspected that the two facts were related. He was not ungrateful for the customers. He was not unaware of the irony. Among the regulars who had begun to form the bedrock of Carter's customer base in those early weeks was an older man who arrived without fail every Friday morning between 9 and 9:30. He drove a practical sedan unremarkable in every way and parked it in the far corner of the lot with a neatness that suggested long habit. He wore the same style of clothing each week: khaki trousers, a collared shirt, a canvas jacket in the cooler months, and he carried a canvas tote bag for his purchases. His name was Samuel Brooks. He was somewhere in his late 60s or early 70s, with white hair kept short and a face that had spent enough time outdoors to carry a permanent weathered quality. He moved without hurry and spoke without raising his voice, and he had the manner of someone who had over a long life become entirely comfortable with silence. Samuel always bought the same thing, a pound and a half of fresh shrimp, whatever white fish had come in that week, and if Ethan had them, a dozen clams. He paid in cash, which was rare enough among customers of his apparent age that Ethan noticed it. After making his purchases, he would sometimes linger, accepting a paper cup of coffee that Ethan kept on the counter for regulars, and he would sit in one of the porch chairs and watch the harbor for a while. He and Ethan talked easily. They talked about the weather, about which fish were running and which weren't, about the particular character of different seasons on the coast, about the history of the waterfront district and the way the town had changed over the years. Samuel spoke about Harbor Point with the familiarity of long residents, though he never mentioned where exactly he lived or what he did or had done for a living. Ethan liked him without qualification. Samuel was the kind of person whose company is simply restful, not because he was a simple man, but because he seemed genuinely interested in everything and flustered by nothing. He laughed at the right moments and asked good questions, and never offered opinions on subjects he didn't know well. When Ethan mentioned at some point in their fourth or fifth conversation that he had been dealing with a series of inspections that seemed to originate from a neighbor with concerns about the business, Samuel listened attentively and then asked with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than alarm whether everything was properly documented. When Ethan said yes, Samuel nodded and said that in his experience, documentation had a way of resolving most things eventually, and they moved on to talking about the blue crab season. It did not occur to Ethan to ask what Samuel's experience was or in what field it had been accumulated. He had the courtesy not to pry, and Samuel had the ease of someone who did not volunteer information that hadn't been asked for. They were both comfortable with that arrangement. Several weeks passed in which Samuel appeared every Friday, and they talked, and Samuel bought his shrimp and his fish and drove away in the sensible sedan, and Ethan thought of him simply as one of the good things about the job, the kind of regular customer who makes a small business feel like it belongs where it is. Veronica Hargrove's 14th complaint was the most elaborate by some distance. She had, in the 8 weeks since Ethan's opening, refined her method, and the document she brought to the county building on the morning she filed complaint 14 was not a single-page grievance form, but a compiled dossier, 31 pages, including photographic exhibits, a summary of all 13 prior complaints with their filing dates and resolution outcomes, a legal memorandum she had apparently obtained from somewhere arguing that the cumulative impact of the market's operations on adjacent residential property values constituted a form of commercial nuisance under county code, and a cover letter addressed to the county's Zoning and Land Use Division, requesting a comprehensive review of the market's operating permit. She also called the county and requested that a senior inspector attend rather than the standard rotational staff. She specified that she wanted someone with authority to make binding determinations on the spot, not merely conduct an assessment for later review. She was told that the county would send whoever was available. She arrived at Carter's Fresh Catch on a Tuesday morning at 9:45, before many customers had come in carrying the dossier in a leather portfolio that was itself an implied statement of seriousness. She wore a business suit. She had brought, apparently anticipating an audience, a specific clarity of purpose that Ethan recognized from her first visit, the look of someone who had prepared carefully for a conversation they expected to win. The inspector who arrived 20 minutes later was a younger man, mid-30s, with an official county badge and a tablet computer he used for documentation. He introduced himself at the door and accepted the copy of the dossier that Veronica had prepared for him. He reviewed the cover letter. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the shop. He was preparing to begin when he glanced toward the porch where several customers were having coffee in the morning sun, and he stopped. His posture changed in a way that was visible even from across the room. He straightened, not nervously, but with the specific kind of attentiveness that happens when a subordinate unexpectedly encounters a superior in a casual setting. Samuel Brooks was in his usual chair, holding his paper cup, looking out toward the harbor. The inspector crossed the room in a few strides and said with evident deference something that Ethan didn't fully catch, a greeting that included a title. Samuel looked up without surprise, as though the inspector's reaction was familiar to him, and nodded pleasantly. They exchanged a few words. Veronica had followed the inspector toward the porch with the expression of someone who has not been told that the program has changed and is now watching events unfold in a direction she had not prepared for. She was looking at Samuel with the careful attention of someone trying to place a face. Samuel stood up slowly, the way people do when they have made a decision rather than when they have been prompted. He set his coffee cup on the small table beside the chair. He smiled at Ethan briefly in a way that contained something Ethan would think about later. Not apology, not pity, but a kind of acknowledgement. Then he turned to the inspector and asked in a voice that was entirely ordinary and completely authoritative whether the inspector had the full case file. Veronica Hargrove had gone still. The inspector opened his tablet and pulled up the case record for Carter's fresh catch all 14 complaints, their filing dates, the responding departments, the inspectors who had conducted each assessment, and the outcomes. Samuel asked him to read through them. The inspector read them. He read them clearly, at a normal volume, standing in the doorway between the porch and the main floor of the market where the 5 or 6 customers who had drifted in during the morning could hear without effort. The complaints were not in aggregate more reasonable than they had seemed individually. If anything heard in sequence, they acquired a quality that several of the people present seemed to find striking, a quality of accumulation, of systematic application, of a repeated effort to find something wrong with a business that had 14 times over been found to be operating in full compliance with every applicable rule and regulation. Complaint 1, noise from delivery operations. No violation found. Complaint 2, non-compliant exterior signage. No violation found. Complaint 3, insufficient parking and unlawful shoulder use. No violation found. Complaint 4, health code concerns regarding outdoor seafood display. No violation found. Complaint 5, overweight delivery vehicles causing road damage. No violation found. Complaint 6, exterior equipment constituting an eyesore under beautification ordinance. No violation found. Complaint 7, kitchen exhaust fan generating odor nuisance. No violation found. Complaint 8, unpermitted expansion of commercial footprint via outdoor seating. No violation found. Complaint 9, improper waste storage and disposal practices. No violation found. Complaint 10, insufficient lighting creating a safety hazard in the parking area. No violation found. Complaint 11, commercial signage illumination exceeding permitted brightness levels. No violation found. Complaint 12, delivery scheduling violating morning quiet hours. No violation found. Complaint 13, ice storage equipment obstructing pedestrian access to adjacent public path. No violation found. Complaint 14, cumulative commercial nuisance impacting adjacent residential property values. Samuel listened to all of this. When the inspector finished reading, there was a moment of quiet that had a particular texture to it, not the quiet of awkwardness, but the quiet of completion of something, having arrived at the end of a long road. Samuel turned to Veronica then. He introduced himself by name and title. He was Samuel Brooks, and he was the chairman of the County Zoning and Land Use Commission. He had served in that role for 11 years. He had spent those years developing the regulatory framework that governed commercial and residential land use across the county, including the waterfront district of Harbor Point and the ridge community above it, including Bayside Estates. He knew the ordinances by number and by chapter. He had written several of them. Before joining the commission, he had practiced land use law for nearly 2 decades, and before that he had grown up in a coastal town not unlike Harbor Point, which was part of why he had retired to this one. He had, in other words, spent the better part of his professional life thinking carefully about exactly the kinds of questions that Veronica Hargrove had apparently assumed were simple. Veronica said nothing. Whatever she had expected from the morning, it had not been this. The leather portfolio was still in her hands, but she was no longer holding it with any of the earlier authority. One of the customers near the back of the room had set down his coffee cup. No one moved. Samuel spoke without rancor. He reviewed for the benefit of everyone present the legal standing of Carter's Fresh Catch, the commercial zoning classification of the waterfront district, the scope of permits required for a retail seafood operation of this size and type, the applicable noise ordinances and how the market's operations related to them, and the distinction between a legitimate land use complaint and the systematic application of complaint mechanisms as a form of harassment against a lawfully operating business. He was thorough. He was clear. He was not unkind, but he was entirely precise. He spoke for perhaps 12 minutes without consulting any notes, citing ordinance numbers from memory and cross-referencing them with the county code provisions that Veronica's legal memorandum had invoked, and the effect of hearing someone explain in careful and accurate detail exactly how and why each of those invocations had been either misapplied or inapplicable was not a comfortable one for the person who had commissioned that memorandum. Several of the people standing in the market that morning would later describe the experience as watching someone calmly dismantle a very elaborate piece of furniture using only the exact tools that had been used to build it. Then he discussed consequences. He explained that the county's Zoning Enforcement Division had the authority to investigate patterns of complaint filing that appeared designed to burden a business rather than address genuine regulatory concerns. He explained that such investigations, when they resulted in findings, could have implications for the party who had filed the complaints. Implications that included civil liability for damages sustained by the targeted business during the period of harassment, administrative sanctions, and in some cases, referral to the county attorney's office. He explained that homeowners associations were not exempt from these provisions, and that the officers of such associations could be held personally responsible for actions taken in an official capacity that were found to constitute abuse of the regulatory system. Han delivered all of this in the same, even unhurried voice he used when talking about blue crabs and fishing weather, and he watched Veronica Hargrove absorb every word with the expression of someone who had just learned that the game they thought they were playing had very different rules than they had assumed. There were 3 residents of Bayside Estates in the market that morning. None of them had come with Veronica. They were simply customers, people who had started coming to Carter's in the weeks since the buzz about the inspection saga had spread through town. They were watching their HOA president stand in a seafood market with a 31-page dossier in a leather portfolio and nothing to say. And the particular shame of that moment, the second-hand kind, the kind that falls on bystanders who share an affiliation with the person at the center of it, was visible on their faces. One of them had known Veronica for years. She did not look at her. The 14th complaint was not formally processed. The inspector, following a brief consultation with Samuel on the porch, noted in his case file that the complaint had been reviewed and found to lack any substantive regulatory basis, and that the cumulative record of complaints against the same business by the same complainant had been flagged for review by the county's Land Use Compliance Office. A letter went to Veronica Hargrove's address of record at Bayside Estates within the week. Ethan was not told exactly what the letter said, but the practical effect became clear. Within days, no more inspectors appeared at his door. No more envelopes arrived from county departments. The phone didn't ring with schedulers confirming appointment times. The particular silence that followed was one of the most satisfying sounds Ethan had ever heard. The business had already changed by the time the complaints stopped. The steady stream of curiosity-driven customers who had come through in the weeks when the market was the subject of town conversation had not all disappeared once the news cycle moved on. A good number of them had become regulars, people who had found the market by accident and stayed because the fish was genuinely good and the prices were honest. And Ethan made a chowder that was worth driving 20 minutes for. The Saturday morning rush had become a fixed feature of the week. The porch tables were full on warm days. Dennis at the bait and tackle shop said he'd never seen the waterfront district this active in the middle of the week. A local newspaper ran a short piece about the market under a headline that was either straightforwardly descriptive or quietly ironic, depending on how you read it. The piece didn't go into detail about the complaints or the HOA. It was mostly about Ethan's background and the sourcing practices he used and the particular charm of the market's location, but it mentioned in passing that Carter's Fresh Catch had become one of the more talked about businesses in town. That mention alone drove 3 weeks of elevated foot traffic from people in neighboring communities who read the paper online. A food writer from a regional travel publication sent an email asking if she could do a feature. A bed and breakfast owner proposed putting together a weekend package that included a cooking class using seafood sourced from the market. A local brewery reached out about a collaboration for a chowder and beer pairing night. Ethan said yes to all of it carefully on his own terms. He was still rising before dawn every Tuesday and Friday. He was still doing the filleting himself and making the chowder in batches he could guarantee the quality of. He expanded the porch seating and added 2 large outdoor picnic tables on the side of the building that faced the water. And on the first Saturday of each month, he started hosting a small market event where he brought in a few local producers, a bakery, a jam maker, a woman who sold preserves from her farm outside of town, and let them set up tables alongside his. The events drew crowds large enough that he had to negotiate a parking arrangement with the empty lot 2 buildings down. He negotiated that arrangement directly with the lot's owner, a retired contractor named Phil, who had watched the whole saga from the window of the building next door and was more than happy to work something out. He hired a part-time assistant, a recent graduate named Tyler, who was good with customers and quick to learn the rhythm of the cases and the cold room. Tyler had the particular gift of being able to explain the difference between various species of flounder to someone who had never thought much about flounder before in a way that was informative, without being condescending, which Ethan considered an undervalued professional skill. He started doing special orders for restaurants in 2 neighboring towns, building the commercial side of the business slowly and without overextending the supply relationships he had spent 2 years establishing. He was careful. He had always been careful. That hadn't changed. What had changed was the shape of the thing he was being careful with. It was larger now and more complicated, and it required a different kind of attention than it had in the early weeks. But the underlying discipline was the same. Do the work right. Source the product honestly. Keep the cases clean and the prices fair and the chowder worth driving for. Everything else, Ethan had learned, tended to follow from that. The waterfront district itself seemed to benefit from the market's success in ways that were harder to quantify, but no less real. Dennis at the bait and tackle shop reported a noticeable uptick in foot traffic on Saturdays that he attributed directly to the market events, saying that customers who came for the fish often stopped in for gear on their way back to their cars. The kayak rental operation extended its season by 2 weeks on each end, partly because the increased waterfront activity through the fall had persuaded the owner that there was more year-round appetite for the experience than he had assumed. Even the breakfast diner added a lunch service on Saturdays, a change the owner had resisted for years, motivated finally by the fact that there were now reliably enough people on the waterfront at midday to justify the additional staff. Samuel Brooks came in every Friday morning the same as always. He bought his shrimp and his white fish and his clams. He had his coffee on the porch. He talked to Ethan about the weather and the tides, and occasionally about the minor dramas of town governance that he had opinions about, but was far too discreet to share with anyone except apparently the man who made his favorite chowder. The two of them had settled into the kind of easy friendship that forms between people who respect each other without needing to define the terms of it. Ethan had been careful after the incident with Veronica and the inspector not to make too much of what Samuel had done, not to treat him differently, not to introduce a weight of gratitude into what had been, until that Tuesday morning, a pleasantly simple friendship. Samuel, for his part, seemed to prefer that arrangement, and there had been no need for either of them to say so directly. One Friday, in late autumn, when the harbor was gray and the air had the first real edge of cold in it, and the market was quiet, in the way that Tuesday mornings in November tend to be, Samuel finished his coffee and stood up from the porch chair and looked at the water for a moment in the way he sometimes did before leaving, as though he was checking something against some internal record of the way things were supposed to look. Ethan had just finished wrapping the last order of the morning and had come to the doorway with his own cup. He said, without planning to say it, that he had been meaning to thank Samuel properly for what had happened in the summer. Not just for the intervention itself, but for the way it had gone, the fact that nothing had been cruel, that it had been precise and proportionate and public, in a way that felt in retrospect like the right kind of justice for the situation. Samuel turned and looked at him with an expression that was genuinely amused. He said that Ethan had it backward. He said that he had come to the market that Tuesday morning the same way he came every Tuesday morning for the shrimp and the fish and the chowder and the company. What had happened because the facts were what they were. He had simply been present when they needed to be stated clearly. He told Ethan that the market was doing well because Ethan had built it to do well, that the permits were in order because Ethan had gotten the permits in order, that the inspections had come up clean because the business was actually clean, that the customers had kept coming because the fish was actually good and the prices were actually honest and the chowder was actually worth driving for. None of that had anything to do with Samuel. He picked up his tote bag and started toward his car, and then he stopped and looked back and said, "I didn't save your business, Ethan. You did that yourself by doing things the right way." He said it simply, without drama, in the same tone he used when he was explaining what depth the bluefish were running at, and then he walked to the sensible sedan and put the tote bag in the back and drove away. Ethan stood on the porch for a while after the car disappeared around the corner. The harbor was flat and gray under the November sky. A couple of gulls were working a piling at the far end of the dock. Inside, the display cases were stocked and gleaming. The chowder was ready on the back burner. The chalkboard was freshly written. He had 4 events on the calendar for December, 2 wholesale orders to fill before the end of the week, and a part-time employee inside who was learning the work with the same patience that Ethan had once learned it himself. The morning light off the water had the pale, clean quality that November mornings in harbor towns have, not warm but clear in a way that summer light rarely manages, as though the cold had clarified everything down to its essential shapes and stripped away the things that didn't belong. I thought about the 14 complaints. He thought about the mornings he had stood in the same doorway, waiting for the knock of an inspector, running through his documentation in his head, reminding himself that everything was in order, and that the truth of a situation had a way of being sufficient if you could hold steady long enough for it to arrive. He thought about how small the business had seemed in those weeks when the complaints were coming in regularly, and how different it looked now, not because it had grown so dramatically though it had grown, but because it felt for the first time entirely settled, as though the ground beneath it had been tested and had held. The process that Veronica had designed to break the market had done the opposite of that. It had tested every foundation of the thing, and every foundation had been solid, and the testing had proven that in a way that no amount of ordinary success could have provided on its own. He also thought briefly, and without particular malice, about Veronica Hargrove. He had heard through the indirect channels of a small town that there had been an HOA meeting that was described by those who attended as tense. He had heard that at least 2 of the resident families had raised questions about the association's decision-making process and the use of HOA resources in pursuing the complaints. He did not know what had come of those questions, and he found that he did not spend very much time wondering. Some things resolved themselves and some things didn't, and the resolution or lack of it was rarely as satisfying as you imagined it would be when you were in the middle of being wronged. What mattered in the end was not what happened to Veronica. What mattered was what happened to the market. And the market was standing and growing and full of the smell of good chowder on a cold November morning, and that was sufficient in every way that counted. He finished his coffee and went back inside. Tyler was arranging the afternoon display, and the radio behind the counter was playing something quiet. The doorbell rang at 10:23 and then again at 10:31, and by 11 the porch was half full and the chowder pot needed stirring, and the day had become what it was supposed to be: ordinary and good, in the way that a thing becomes ordinary and good when it has survived enough tests to no longer need to prove itself. Outside, the harbor moved the way it always moved. The boats sat at their moorings. The dock workers went about their work. The waterfront district received its visitors the same way it always had, without ceremony, without fanfare, in the simple and uncomplicated style of a place that has always known what it was and never needed anyone's permission to continue being it. 14 complaints had been filed against Carter's fresh catch in the space of 8 weeks. Not one of them had found a single violation. Not one of them had come close. And together, not in spite of what they were, but because of what they were, they had turned a modest waterfront market into something the entire harbor town had adopted as its own. Veronica Hargrove had wanted to erase the market from the landscape. What she had done instead was make it permanent. 14 complaints were supposed to shut down the seafood market. Instead, they turned it into the most successful business on the entire waterfront.